we have a lot of ground to cover tonight, so I'm just going to kind of start right into it. In 1679, a ship, Griffon, appeared in Lake Erie, and 44 days later it disappeared. 350 years later we're still talking about it because it's a mystery, and nobody likes mystery better than historians. As if the Griffon has been written about over the years, there's been more and more layers of this mysterious past added to it. Almost everything you know about the Griffon is not correct. It may not even have been named the Griffon. Actually, Salle, who built it, never once referred to it by name as a Griffon. Neither did his second-in-command, Tante. So if it wasn't named a Griffon, why would it have a Griffon figurehead and all the other things you see that artists like to add to it? It wasn't built for the fur trade, or if you read any school book, it will tell you that it's built for the fur trade. It really wasn't. It was built for a journey of discovery. Now this has to go back to Spain and the southwestern United States. France at this time, because of the fur trade, were located farther to the north than any other of the European colonies. Because of that, they were landlocked every winter for 6 months. You couldn't get in or out of New France and Canada because the St. Lawrence River would freeze over. So what they were looking for was a warm water port. And they kept hearing from the Indians these stories of a river that ran from almost the bottom of the Great Lakes, bottom of Lake Michigan, all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. And this would be their answer. They could have all-year navigation. They wouldn't be totally shut off for half the year. So with that in mind, there's several characters that we have to look at that are involved with the building of the Griffon. Some of you will be really familiar with, some you may not have heard of before. This is the Salle that most school books picture, the intrepid explorer, which he was. He was an incredible stamina. He walked thousands of miles and actually claimed half of the continent of North America in the name of France without firing a shot. What's kind of misleading, besides the armor, unless it's against mosquitoes, the crew that were behind it, they weren't there just because they liked to make walks in the wood. They were there because they were paid and they expected to be paid. That's a whole other part of the story. Salle had a darker side that was only really coming out in the history books since the mid-1950s. He was a strange, complex character. A lot of modern-day doctors have diagnosed him, and they all agree to the same thing, that if he were around today, he would be under a lot of medication. He was paranoid, maniac depressive. It's now bipolar, but he's been diagnosed with that. He had a persecution complex. He considered his men as useful necessities. He was brought up, he was born into a rich linen importing family in Rouen, France. Went to Jesuit school because they gave the best technical education at the time. In fact, he became so enthralled with the Jesuits that he actually decided to become a Jesuit missionary. And the problem with this is, to do that, you had to relinquish all your worldly goods. So even though he came from a wealthy family, he had to do away with any fortune or any money he would have gotten from them. When he realized that the Jesuits were not going to send him on a mission as he had wanted, so desperately, he asked to be relieved of his order and his vows, and he left the Jesuit mission. So here he was, 21 years old, the best education you could get in the day, penniless, and no job prospects in sight. Kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it? But he did have one thing he could call on. His brother, Jean Cavalier, was already established in Canada, or New France, as a Sepulchre missionary. So with his contacts, he was able to get LaSalle over to this country and set him up in his own farm. Now, LaSalle's second in command, we're actually just talking about people that had something to do with the Griffon being built. His second in command was this guy, Henry Tante. He was an Italian mercenary. Became good friends with LaSalle and surprisingly remained good friends for all of their lives. He was the one that constantly smoothed over LaSalle's relationship with his men. And it was actually him that got most of the things done. No job was too disagreeable or too dangerous that he wouldn't do with LaSalle. And LaSalle took advantage of this quite a bit. Now the one person you've probably never heard of is Mose Hillret. He's the man who actually built the Griffon. He was a 23-year-old master shipwright when he was brought over from France to establish the shipbuilding industry in Canada or New France. He was a very accomplished shipbuilder. He had already built 5 ships on the Great Lakes, 4 of them on Lake Ontario, under the same conditions that the Griffon was going to be built in. So he was very familiar with building under these frontier circumstances. He was a very accomplished shipbuilder. He really knew how to get things done, as we'll see. Now, all these men were under the command of actually Count Frontenac. He was the Governor General of Canada. Now, this was not an elected position. It was appointed by the King. But because he was appointed by the King, he was not supposed to be involved in the fur trade. He was not supposed to lower himself to get into the lucrative fur trade. But through LaSalle, he thought and saw a way around this. He could use LaSalle's drive and energy, and plus his conniving, Frontenac's conniving, because he still had a lot of connections with the French court. So it was between him and LaSalle. They came up with an idea to hand to the King, Louis XIV, a petition to allow him to search for the Mississippi River. And this was kind of a front, because what they were really looking for was untapped fur territory west of the Mississippi. But because they couched it in such words that it was more claiming it for France, claiming the Mississippi for France, the King agreed to it. He did have a few conditions. One is that it had to be done in 5 years. The second was it would all be at LaSalle's expense. But to help LaSalle with the expense of this, he agreed to let him have sole rights to all the fur-bearing animals along the Mississippi watershed, including all the bison and buffalo. So if this had happened at this time, the North American continent would have changed a great deal, especially for the North American Indians. But now with this petition in hand, he had no trouble borrowing money, because you have to remember he was still penniless. So with this petition in hand, he borrowed money and he began getting everything he would need to build 2 ships, because this exploration scheme called for 2 ships. One to carry the material to build the ship to go down the Mississippi. So he needed 2 ships, which meant 4 anchors, possibly 7 cannon, all the sails, all the rigging, the armament, a forge for the metalwork. Everything that he couldn't get in New France had to be bought in France and transported over. Now, when it was brought here, back up a little bit, to show some of the material that he would have bought to build the 2 ships. The guy in the center, looking a little bit like the Verner's gnome. This was Luke the pilot. And this was the one dumbest mistake that LaSalle made out of many, to hire this guy as a pilot. I've often wondered why, because he had competent pilots he was already using on Lake Ontario. But when I read about this guy, he was accomplished in handling boats that about the size of the Griffon. But he also was familiar with the waters of the Caribbean. And I thought, why would that be necessary? But then if you think, if they did accomplish building the ship on the Mississippi to sail back to France, they would have to go through the Gulf of Mexico out into the Caribbean. So I think that's probably one of the major reasons he picked Luke. Now Luke has been described in history books as being Danish. He wasn't, he was French. 7 feet tall. He wasn't, he was short, bushy hair. That's the only description we have. And LaSalle himself penned that. He was a short stature, wore typical seafaring clothes of the period, and had bushy hair and beard. So with all these supplies being stockpiled in what is now Kingston, Ontario, he began using the 4 ships that I mentioned beforehand to shuttle these supplies to, okay, that shows November 18th, that's roughly where Kingston, Ontario is. They began shuttling the supplies to build the 2 ships for those boats, stockpiling them at what we would call now a forward operating base. And everybody was, they had all the supplies there. Salle and turned the boat over the loop, and they sailed with looping control to the foot of the Niagara River. And they had to cart everything 30 miles to where the site that Salle had chosen to build the Griffon. Now, 30 miles doesn't look bad on the map, but there was one impediment.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess so.
This thing was the stymied westward expansion until 1825, the year it now was built. But in the meantime, there were some Indian trails around the falls. These had been used to carry nothing bigger than canoes. But Salle and Tante had to deal with all the supplies to build those 2 ships, which meant 4 anchors, which could have weighed 1,200 pounds each, 5 cannons that weighed 730 pounds each, plus all the other supplies that we talked about. Now, I'm sure it was an advantage that they did this in the wintertime because you could use sleds, but they still had to get it up 150 feet around the Niagara escarpment. And this had never been done before. In fact, if they had accomplished nothing else, this would have been an epic accomplishment, just getting the material to build these 2 ships around Niagara Falls. Now, on the way, while they were getting all the material around the falls, Mosaic Hilleret, the shipbuilder, would have went ahead marking the trees that they had to cut down to build the ship. Because then, as now, any strength in the wooden ship depends on the direction of the wind. So this was a very critical and important part of the whole operation. Now, these men that he hired to do this, most of them were from the south of France, had never been to North America before. I'm sure they had no idea what they were getting into, what a North American winter would be like, not to mention the Indians they had to deal with. But the fact that they pulled it off is really, I think, quite an accomplishment. It says something for the, of course, what else could they do? Desertion was out of the question. If they wanted fed, they had to stick around as a group because they had to hire hunters to provision them. So they were kind of stuck, but they did pull it off. And when they got the material to the building site, they set up stages where they would use a handsaw, a huge handsaw. They began cutting the planks and cutting the framing to start building the Griffon. Now, this was under winter conditions. This was a typical eastern Lake Erie winter, probably with intermittent freezing rain and blizzards. So it probably wasn't very nice to work outside like they did, 24, from dawn to dark every day. Now, when the Griffon was started, they had laid the frame, the keel. Salle decided this would be a good time to walk back to Kingston, Ontario. She walked back 200 miles over the frozen lake. Some accounts said 2 men went with him, and I believe that they had such a shortage of crew that he wouldn't have taken the men away from the shipbuilding. Instead, another account said he used one of the Indian dogs to carry some of his provisions. Now, before you get too sentimental about a man and his dog, if game was short, well, the dogs ended up as the first wheels on wheels. Now, the reason he had to walk all the way back to Kingston, Ontario was because Luke, who had command of one of the supply ships, managed to sink it. And on board it were all their provisions and foodstuffs that they were going to have to use the next year. So because of this, Salle had to walk back to Kingston, Ontario, and probably back to Montreal to get to replace the anchors and everything that was lost on the ship. He stayed in Kingston with a wealthy widow for that whole winter. So it really wasn't much of a choice, was it? Freeze out at the shipbuilding site or stay in civilization with a wealthy widow. He managed to stay there until the end of June. He also borrowed money from her, which she never got back. In fact, she never saw that Salle again. So August, back at the shipbuilding site, they had set up a forge because remember, everything had to be handmade right there on the spot to fit. It probably was the warmest place in the whole operation. The rudder had to be installed. Everything that, with the possible exception of tar, they had a tar building, a tar making industry set up in Montreal. So they may have used tar from Montreal, but everything else had to be brought at a great expense from France. Every spar, every bit of yard, every mast had to be hand cut and carved on a letting spot. So under Mosaic Hill, at the same time, the remaining supplies had to be got shoveled back and forth. So this was a pretty intense ongoing operation. And this is what they came up with. Very substantial, seaworthy ship, actually about 50 feet long, small but perfect for what they needed it for. And it's just incredible how quickly they built it under the conditions they did. And Mosaic Hill really knew how to get things done. And this was the result of all that labor. In May, they launched her and actually probably finished her up while she was still floating. By this time, the Seneca Indians, who had allowed him to build it on their property, he told them it was going to be a floating warehouse and that it would actually bring down the price of trade goods because they could now ship them in quantity. Well, when the Indians finally saw what it was going to be with the cannons and all the armament that was on it, they realized this was like a floating fortress. So they got a little upset. They began harassing the workers, and it was actually a plot to burn the Griffon before they could launch it. So launching it prematurely actually was to their best interest because they could sleep safely on board it and spend the rest of the time while they waited for the Salle to come back, finishing off the ship. And this is a cross-section of what it probably looked like. It was 7.5 feet deep in the hold. Now the hold was completely filled with Indian trade goods and the supplies to build the other ship. There were no provisions for the crew to stay in the hold. It was strictly cargo. So that 7.5 by 14 feet was totally off limits to the crew. Now the cannons that you see, she was slated to carry them, but under the conditions that they built it in, I really can't see them building those intricate carriages. It's more likely that the cannons were carried as ballast deep down in the hull, which was a standard procedure in those days. All the instruments to work the ship, the cleats, the blocks, the deadheads were all being made on site, crude, but they weren't supposed to last forever. They did a good job for what they needed. All the iron parts were hand forged right on the site. For armament, they carried these small breech-loading cannons. There were 4 of those on the Griffon. These were basically anti-personnel weapons. They were like huge shotguns. And they had a really rapid rate of fire because the gunpowder charge could be loaded separately, and they would fire anything, even handfuls of stones. So these were very good anti-personnel weapons. First, thankfully, they never had to use them. So here the Griffon's all ready to go, and they found out where they built it. About the middle of the Niagara River. When they put it out into the river, the current was too fast. They couldn't reach the current even with the sails up and with favorable winds. So they selected 12 of the lucky crew members who got to get in the harness, and they hauled her to 4 miles to the opening of Lake Erie. Of course, the Salle and Tante and everyone else was still on board, giving them encouragement, I'm sure.
Encouragement.
On board the ship itself, it's kind of interesting, ships of this period, they were very workable. They look crude to our eyes, but when you consider how they were built, they actually were quite sophisticated for the time period. It's not even known if LaSalle had a compass on board the Griffon. He carried one personally in later years, but there's nowhere is it recorded there was actually a compass on the Griffon. The crew, like I said before, lived on deck. There was no shelter for them below deck. Everything they did, from eating, sleeping, and food preparation, was all done on the deck. Rain, shine, or whatever the weather, they were out on deck. And food was prepared on deck. There were no signs in French saying employees must wash their hands after using the restroom because there were no restrooms. So don't think about that too long. So August 7th, LaSalle had shown up from Fort Frontenac. The ship had reached by towing the mouth of the Niagara River and was ready to embark on the first ever voyage of a ship on the upper Great Lakes. Now, you see that little blip where it says August 8th, fog? What had happened, LaSalle had turned the boat over to Luke, who had already sunk one ship. He gave him explicit instructions to stay on the southern shore of the lake. It was dark, there was fog, LaSalle turned in, Luke said, let's just head west. So they headed west, and pretty soon the crew began hearing breakers on the shoreline. And they told Luke that they could hear breakers, and he said, well, it's just the echo, the sound echoing through the fog. The crew got worried enough that they woke LaSalle up. Now, LaSalle had been through here at least once before, possibly twice. He was familiar with Long Point. And when he realized they were heading right towards that deadly peninsula, he immediately had the boat turn to the north. Of course, they were in dense fog, and when they turned to the north, they didn't know where they were, which makes me believe they didn't have a compass. Until he heard breakers again, he had the boat turned around again, and they headed south. By this time, it was midday. They could see where they were, so they continued on to the west. Now, this was strike 2 against Luke. He almost sank the Griffon again. Good progress with no problems right until August 11th when they came to the mouth of the Detroit River. It was dawn, and as it got light, you could see it was a bewildering array of islands and false channels, not at all what it's like today. Most of it was marshland. It was possible to go through in a canoe, but they had no idea how they were going to get a boat like the Griffon that drew at least 5 feet of depth. But then as the fog lifted and the morning cleared up, they could see 3 pillars of smoke on the west side of the river. And that was a signal from Tante, faithful Tante, who LaSalle had sent ahead 2 weeks before to scout a way that the Griffon could get through the Detroit River. The 3 columns of smoke were signals that he had found it. So I think this is like an iconic moment in Great Lakes history. The first ship and what they had to go through just to find where the huge power plant is built today. So with picked up Tante, they continued on up the Detroit River, marveling at its beauty. The shoreline was just teeming with game. There were fruit trees everywhere. There was so much game because they probably didn't realize that it was an uninhabited area. The Iroquois, in their bid to take over the fur trade, had driven out all the Indians that had lived here originally. So it was totally like a paradise with no human contact with the animals in that area. But they started shooting them, and pretty soon they had a lot of jerky hanging from the rigging of the Griffon. August 12th, they reached Lake St. Clair, sailed across it. As mentioned before, they named it for that day's saint. St. Clair was her feast day, doing away with the ancient Iroquois name for St. Clair. They went through the lake, got up to the St. Clair River, and you notice it took them from August 12th to August 23rd. Because they didn't have he hadn't sent anyone ahead to actually scout it, so they had to actually resort to this 12 crew members again, towing her along the shoreline. And when they finally got to the mouth of Lake Huron, this had to be the time when LaSalle probably kind of relaxed because he realized that he might pull this off after all. They had, as long as they stayed out in deep water, they would have no problems. And he had been up in this area before by canoe. But I like to think too that being out in the lake like this, probably further out than any canoe had ever gone. So it was the first time you would see so many of the landmarks, distinctive landmarks that we know about today, from out in the lake. So August 23rd is when they made the mouth, or entered into Lake Huron. They sailed with a favorable wind. They went along the Canadian side and crossed the tip of the thumb, across Saginaw Bay. August 24th, they made landfall probably around the Tawas. Stayed a little closer to the shoreline and was heading north. Between August 25th and 26th, they got struck by one of these early fall storms that just come up out of nowhere. Almost lost the Griffon. LaSalle himself, who was normally stoic, actually dropped to his knees and prayed that he be delivered from this terrible storm. And Luke, the pilot, apparently did a lot of swearing, saying that he was an ocean sailor and he didn't intend to die on an inland lake. So either the praying or the swearing worked. The storm lifted. August 26th, August 27th, they found their way anchored in what is now East Moran Bay and what is now St. Ignace. It was a small Jesuit mission. And when they realized that was Mackinac Island on the right-hand side of the screen, Salle immediately sent some of the crew to get fudge. Well, they could have. I mean, nobody knows that. What he did do, he donned his official red coat and with an armed bodyguard, he went ashore, but he got a frosty reception, not what he was expecting at all. You know, word really traveled fast in these frontier days. It's just incredible how quickly the Indians could find out about something that went on down in the lower lakes. The Indians knew that the fur traders and the Indians knew that what he was actually trying to do was find unexplored fur-bearing territory. And they weren't very happy about that because whoever got in to claim it first would have a claim to get a permit to buy furs there. The Jesuits weren't too happy because they knew that Salle was an ex-Jesuit, and to make the point even sharper, he had included someone from each of the other religious orders, the Sulpicians and the Franciscans, but no Jesuits on this journey. So they knew that he was going to get into uncharted territory, and these other two missionaries would have a chance of getting in first before anyone else. But it was when he went ashore that he found out something else. He found out that one of the advance parties that he had sent ahead the year before, half of them had deserted, and they'd stolen all his trade goods and were living pretty well at his expense 50 miles north of Sault Ste. Marie. So this is when he made the first of the decisions that were going to eventually doom the Griffon. He detailed Tonto to take 9 men and half of their canoes and go up the St. Mary's River, find the deserters, and bring them back. Now, splitting your forces when you're just beginning an expedition like this into uncharted territory, probably, in fact, we know it wasn't a wise thing to do at all. Because even though they gave Tonto 10 days to come back, by September 2nd, he still hadn't arrived. In fact, he didn't come back for almost another 2 weeks. So LaSalle decided, again, this is another one of his decisions that are hard to understand, except if you remember that he was under this 5-year contract to claim the Mississippi River. And he was also deeply in debt already, paying off his crew members with borrowed money. So every time they were sitting around, he was still having to pay them. So I'm sure all of that had an influence in him deciding to leave on September 2nd. He left on notification for Tonto to join him at their next scheduled stop, which was Washington Island. So on September 2nd, he left and sailed to roughly the Green Bay area. And if you notice, it took him 2 days to do that. It was a 2-day sail from the Straits of Mackinac to Washington Island on Green Bay. Now, when he got to Green Bay, actually there was a small island called Rock Island. It was just outside Washington Island. The other half of the party that hadn't deserted, they had gone ahead and, even though they weren't supposed to legally do this, they had purchased a fortune's worth of furs at cheap prices from the local Indians. And here was this huge cache of furs that LaSalle could easily use to pay off his debts if he could get them back to the Niagara River. So LaSalle had a dilemma, and his decision was to anchor the Griffon there, and in 2 weeks' time, he lowered all the furs on board the Griffon. Now, his idea was to send the Griffon back to St. Ignace, that she had just left 2 days before, not 2 days, she left on the 2nd. Leave all the shipbuilding stuff to build the other ship at St. Ignace, continue down through Lake Huron, through Lake Erie, and deposit his furs to pay off his debts at Fort Niagara, Kitchener, Ontario. Now, this was not a good plan. There's several other options he could have chose, but apparently this made no sense to him at the time, except for one thing. The only person that he could turn the ship over was Luke. He gave the command of the Griffon to Luke, and this sealed the fate of the Griffon. But you have to remember, it was a short trip, only 2 days back to St. Ignace, So he probably figured what could go wrong. At least the shipbuilding material, and he took a lot of the shipbuilding material that he was going to be using, and he decided he was going to continue on down Lake Michigan in the canoes with the rest of the crew, taking the rest of the shipbuilding material that Luke had dropped off in St. Ignace. So, with a short crew of only 5 men, to handle a ship like this, the furs were actually quite, they had to be very specific in the way they packaged them. Because if they couldn't carry them loose in the canoe, they had to be made into these brick-like packages so that they would interlock together and wouldn't slide around. So this is probably what the furs were loaded like around a Griffon. So on September 18th, the Griffon was loaded with the furs, stolen the material to build the other ship. She headed over to where she had left. And if you remember, it took her 2 days to sail to Washington Island from St. Ignace. So it took her 2 days to sail back because they had a favorable wind. On the 20th, a storm struck the upper Great Lakes. A very, very powerful storm. And we know all this because Salle, who was heading south in a canoe, had to come to a complete stop. It was almost a week where they couldn't move because of the ferocity of the storm. But he worried about the Griffon because he knew the Griffon would be out somewhere in the vicinity of that storm. Well, as it turns out, like a lot of historians have written, the Griffon was caught out unawares by a storm and sunk somewhere in Lake Michigan. Well, it wasn't. The account states that September 20th, when the storm hit, Luke and the Griffon were safely anchored somewhere along the north shore of Lake Michigan. Now we know this because there are accounts of either fur traders or Indians who had spoken to Luke while he was in this safe anchorage. And they told him that the storm was a lot worse than he thought, and that he would find out as soon as he got out of the shelter where he was anchored. Of course, Luke being Luke, decided he had such a short distance to go back to St. Ignace and he would make a run for it. Sure enough, as soon as he left the shelter of the harbor that he was in, those on shore saw him strike what we believe is a reef. It said that he was struck, the ship was tossed in an extraordinary manner. And this all happened within sight of shoreline. He was only 1.5 miles offshore when this happened. So the Griffon probably hit a reef, the cargo possibly shifted on deck, or just the force of the wind itself rolled over the Griffon and she disappeared from sight, right in front of the people that were watching it on the shoreline. So we know for a fact that it's up in the Straits area. Now, this map is, I think, kind of a good indication of how people don't read original history. You see the red line at the top of the Michigan, where the Griffon went for 2 days, and went left until it arrived at the Straits of Mackinac. That's what we know from the record about what happened to the Griffon. The rest of these are all sightings that have been, findings that have been made of the Griffon over the years. That's hard to explain. What happens a lot of times is people will find a record, and then they'll turn somersaults with the facts to try and prove that this is a Griffon. That's why there's been so many false sightings all the way on the Lake Ontario. It's been just incredible how many sightings of the Griffons. It's still happening in the last couple of years. So what we know about the Griffon is that she left Washington Island. 2 days later, the storm sank as she was heading to St. Ignace, and that's where she disappeared. So that's the end of the story of the Griffon for now. Salle, with the rest of the material, including the forge, I don't know how you load a forge in a canoe, but they managed to canoe the length of Lake Michigan in the dead of winter. Just the stamina of these men, I think, is really remarkable. They had just built a ship, the Griffon, under similar circumstances, and now they're going to have to build another one in even worse circumstances once they get the Mississippi River. So they continued on down, built a fort at Fort St. Joseph, and there was Salle. Of course, he had no idea that the Griffon had sank. Watched for it every day for that following year, right into the spring. In the spring, they continued on, found the Mississippi River. He couldn't claim it for the name of France because he had to go to the mouth of the river. So what he did is he left the crew there building the other ship that they were going to use in the Mississippi. And again, he walked back across the base of Michigan, walked to Toledo area, probably was able to get a canoe, canoed back to Montreal, raised the money, borrowed money again to raise a canoe expedition. This one was successful, but it took forever. It took most of the next year. But they finally did make it down to the mouth of the Mississippi River, where he claimed in the name of France. I just wonder if all these Indians realized they were now French citizens. Now, he went back to France again, because claiming the river in the name of France and then holding it was another matter. He realized by now that they were going to have to build forts along the river. So he went back to France, and the skip ahead, raised a full royal expedition. King even gave him a frigate. And the reason for all this protection was because Spain controlled the Gulf of Mexico. He wouldn't let anyone in or out. And the penalty was the ship was taken by France, and the crew were all put to death by strangulation. Well, this kind of kept a lot of people out of the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah. But what's interesting about this painting, this was one of the 4 ships that were originally on the Gulf of Mexico expedition. That one on the right back now was the Labelle. Now that was a ship that was almost identical to the Griffon. It was sunk during this Salle expedition. It was found in 1995. It's remarkably intact. Everything that was still buried below the slope was intact, including most of the hull. The state of Texas raised the money. They actually built a coffin dam around the ship and salvaged it. And it's scattered all over museums in Texas right now. But this gives the route that they took. And this explains why we were so interested in having Luke as a pilot, because if we did get out the Mississippi River, they would have to go through the Dominican Islands and around Cuba. But what's interesting on this voyage, with the official sanction, they missed the mouth of the Mississippi by 400 miles. He put the settlement ashore at one of the most godforsaken spots on earth, Mount Manabora Bay in Texas. They built a fort, which is a fort in the name only. The South spent 2 years walking back trying to find the Mississippi that he missed. He finally realized that his only chance of finding it was to walk north until he was able to go east again, and they could find the Mississippi, and that way they could canoe back up to Montreal. That was his intention. However, when he left on this last walking trip, the people he left behind all disappeared. They were killed by the Indians and disease. There were 200 people, 200 settlers that were killed by the Indians or died from starvation and disease. The Salle took the 10 fittest men and some horses and began trekking north and east to find the Mississippi River. But he still wasn't able to find it because his men, becoming increasingly frustrated with his leadership, actually murdered him, assassinated him. He was 47 years old. They stripped his body, threw it in the bushes. There's never been a trace of this, and I'm not even sure where this actually happened. That was the end of the Salle and the end of the Griffon, at least for now.
Questions?
Yeah, anybody have any questions? Yes.
So many of the paintings and sketches are yours? That's gorgeous.
How about those last 2?
Last 2.
I stole those just all right. I've been working on this since 2020, and COVID kept me in, and I did a lot more illustrations for it than I had originally. So I think it kind of tells the story.
Very good. What was the sale material? Where did it come from?
It was canvas. It wasn't manufactured in New France. They had to bring it from France. Enough sales for 2 ships. But I did read an interesting account of another ship. It wasn't on the Great Lakes that they built. I think it was in Nova Scotia. And it was a different pattern ship for fishing that they wanted to build. They transferred the patterns onto the sails. That solved two problems. It gave them the sales, and they had the layout to make the framing for the ship. And I think that may have been what Hilleret did with the Griffon. They didn't just start out of the blue cutting shapes for frames, but they actually had patterns possible. It's just a theory.
What was the rope making process like, all the cordage to keep that ship going?
Yeah, they had to bring it was all handmade with these rope walks where men and women would just spend countless hours winding the rope and then moving the coils, and that was all brought from France, enough to build 2 ships. One of those coils alone probably weighed a couple hundred pounds. Get all that material, 20 miles. Once they got it on shore, get it 20 miles by hand just by dragging it. You know, later on, in 1818, when they built the Walking Water, they built it approximately the same site. Walking Water was the first steamship on the Great Lakes. They built it on approximately the same site that the Griffon was built. And one of the main clues that they used, one of the main reasons they built it there was because of the easy access to the Niagara River. But one of them noted there were no oak trees in that vicinity. They had to bring in all the oak trees that they needed because the Salle used them in 1679 to build the Griffon. There were oak trees all around that area except where the Griffon was built. And when they built the Walking Water, they faced the same problems that the Griffon had. They couldn't break the current. But when they built the Walking Water, they used almost 40 oxen instead of 12 Frenchmen. Yes?
Two things. First of all, I did see is it the Laval at the State Museum in Texas in Austin. And it is on display there. But secondly, you had a diagram that looked like that some of the base of the hull was recovered. So where was that recovered and where is it now?
That was your Laval. That cross-section of the hull was a typical dark, we call it, of that period. So I used that as a cross-section of what the Griffon, in all probability, would have looked like.
But they never recovered anything from the Griffon?
Not that anyone said. They haven't actually recovered anything from the wreck. There's been a few things associated with the Griffon found over the years, but nothing actually associated with the wreck itself. Yes?
So what do you think of this?
The secret to knowing where the Griffon is knowing where it left on the 20th. It sailed out into that storm. And we drew a line from where we think it left. Now this is a theory. It's always a theory until we actually prove it. We drew a line from where it left and there's a mountain underwater. And I think the reason the Griffon has not been found is because everyone's looking for something that looks like a ship. 350 years on the bottom, particularly in the Straits area, it was covered with an accretion of marl, it's called. It's like a combination of sand and clay. And 350 years has been tree trunks and limbs and everything else entwined around it. And we made a rough measurement. If it were 15 feet high, it would be sitting on its side because it was 14 feet in breadth. If it were 7 feet off the bottom, it would be sitting upright. And it looked to us like it's at least 7 feet off the bottom. So if it's sitting upright, now this is all theory. We have no way. In fact, my friend and I who worked on this with me for almost 10 years, just as we were on the cusp of getting some numbers off that mountain we found in the line, COVID hit, and then the following year he died of cancer. So we just kind of lost our drive, but I'm still working on getting back there to what we actually found. Yes?
Are you incorporating information in a book or some
No, there's a chapter in my book that it's how I wrote on the Griffon, and I did write quite lengthy article. Anyone here remember the Seamaster or Shipmasters? The next issue of the magazine that goes out to the annual meeting is going to have the article I wrote on the Griffon, finding the Griffon. And they may show up someplace else too. I'll try to see to it that it does. Yes?
Before I get to my real question, it occurs to me that most shipwreck hunters are not motivated just by pure history, because of the expense of doing it. Since the furs that were on there, bundled up tightly, were going to be enough to pay off his debts back then, would they still have value today? No. But they're covered by silver, you know.
No, in fact, the furs are probably history right now.
Yeah, okay.
The following year, this is another clue to where we think it is. The following year, they found bundles of rotted furs, a cabin door, and a hatch cover, and sailors' breeches or trousers, and washed up on the east side of Mackinac Island. That's the only record of anything being found from the Griffon from that time period. Now, if anything had gone outside of that area, the local Indians would have known about it, because that kind of information is worth money. That would have been a big deal if they had found anything to prove that the Griffon had actually sank or the circumstances under that it sank. And Salle had to cover himself quite a bit. He wrote a lot of letters giving different explanations of how he thought it sank, and it all boils down to the testimony that he got from the fur traders that actually saw the Griffon leave the north shore of Lake Michigan and then disappeared into the straits. Yeah.
So so the South came down to Mississippi, and he went out to Mississippi.
He didn't go out to Mississippi.
Oh, how do you?
He had to
go to France.
He had to canoe back up against the current of the Mississippi.
Oh, he didn't commit to it.
They canoed back up. Then he went back to France.
Yeah.
Raised the money to raise this other expedition that came in.
What stopped him from going out?
They were afraid of being captured by the Spanish. And they had a lot of trouble with the Indians on the way down the Mississippi River. And they were very leery about encountering some of the same tribes. And this was some of the first real experience that they had with Indian culture. And although it's rarely mentioned in books today, but cannibalism was rampant. And the Indians had said several times they wondered what Frenchman would taste like. Chicken. Well, you know how they like to cook. A lot of sauces on it. Yes.
Maybe 40 years ago, 45 years ago, they were trying to rebuild the Griffon up in Mackinac City, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, it wasn't the Griffon. They built a ship called the Welcome, which is actually, you're right, it's about the same size as the Griffon. But it was a later ship that they had the blueprints from. And it's still up there. It's been moved on. In fact, I just heard that it's going to be put back into tourist-like service this coming year. So that was the Welcome. As far as I know, to my knowledge, they had never built a replica of the Griffon.
Okay, well, that was a while back.
Yeah. Custom.
If you were to find some wood underwater, is there any kind of construction technique that you could possibly still see that would give you fairly conclusive evidence that you found it?
No, that's the unfortunate part about wood-built ships. The techniques to build them have never changed. They still use tree nails or wooden planks to put it together, which sounds like it's not very sophisticated, but it actually was. They worked better, they didn't rust. There may be a few nuts and bolts to hold the keel together. There's no indication that they either made them on site or they bought them. So it wouldn't even do any good to date the wood, because the wood that they built the Griffon with, to be seasoned properly, was probably at least 100, 200 years old. The only thing that would be conclusive are the cannons, because cannons have the cast, year, and the maker's name on them. All sorts of detail tell you just where those cannons were made, which royal armory they were made in, and that precisely dated. They would be the only thing. Trade goods were all in the Straits of Mackinac for the next 200 years. The cannons and probably the swivel guns that we saw. And because the hull, we believe, is sitting upright, 7 feet off the bottom, it's probably still intact. Because when that lady that saw the lapel at the museum, if you notice in the construction of the lapel, the frames are only like a foot apart. It is built almost with solid walls. So it would be extremely, extremely strong. The museum that it's in, the Pollock Museum, they have a website. If you go to it, you can see all the construction details. that they would have used on the Griffon, because this one was built 4 years, the Bell was built 5 years after the Griffon was built. So the construction details wouldn't have changed at all. Yes?
There's a naval auxiliary that's based here in Mount Clemens, and they do a lot of scientific exploration during the summer with young men and women. Called the Noble Odyssey.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if you're familiar with it.
Oh, very much. You know what's kind of ironic about that? The name of the captain of the Noble Odyssey is Luke. He's taking a lot of ribbing about that, because about 5 years ago, they did get a grant for fuel, and they attempted to side scan the bottom where they thought the Griffon had, and they were nowhere near it.
Where does it go?
They're western Lake Michigan, towards the Green Bay area. Okay. Well, yes?
If they knew for a fact where the ship went down in that area, then how did the story get started at East Coast? It was a Lake Salle, which has been part of the Lake Lecture. And that's been a story up there for many, many years.
The only thing you can say is they found the ship and they tried to twist the facts to identify it as a Griffon. And we know from that one illustration that the Griffon only lasted 2 days after it left Washington Island. Not near long enough to get anywhere in Lake Michigan, or for Pete's sake, as far as Lake Ontario. So 2 days with a favorable wind really puts it back in the St. Nicholas area. Yes?
Well, I believe you said that the remnants that washed up on the east shore of the island, so St. Nicholas is on the west, would that have meant that they would have been blown all the way around to the opposite side of the island?
I'm going to call on you. The only way I can answer that is we did a current study of that area, where the currents go at different times of the year. They're totally different in the fall. And the current pattern shows any debris coming ashore anywhere in the straits eventually ends up on the east side of Bicknell Island. So that's the only explanation we had, which makes sense. Yes?
I'm so impressed with your presentation and your historical knowledge, but I'm really impressed with your artwork. And I would love to know if you use models, if your perspective drawings are incredible. You really bring emotion into it when they're pulling the ship. Can you tell us a little bit about your art process, what your materials, pen and ink, pencil, how you did your research, and a little bit about your art?
First of all, I don't want you to stop. You know, it's been an abiding interest with me for the last 10 years. And it really got me curious as to what the Griffon really would have looked like. And you see a lot of other artists that have done it. They have figureheads and carvings all over it, paint, things that the best shipbuilding yards in Europe would have been hard-pressed to do in the amount of time that they actually built it. So I really wanted to try and do a realistic rendering of what it must have looked like. And a couple of those scenes really caught my imagination. This one, when she ended up in East Moran Bay, 100 canoes came out in the season for the first time a sailing ship. So who can imagine 100 canoes at this time coming out to see this almost unworldly or otherworldly ship all of a sudden appear from? And then the other thing I really was interested in was when they stopped at the mouth of the Detroit River. And those 3 smokes came up in the distance showing the time they had found the way through. And those were oil paintings, which I really enjoy working with. Pencil, I really like to do because it's so spontaneous. And there's nothing between your mind and the paper but a pencil. So anything that comes to mind, you can put it down right away. So I like that kind of spontaneous, sketchy look you get from pencil renderings. That's why I like to incorporate it in this. But it's just standard pencil drawings, standard oil painting.
Oil paintings too, yeah.
Were you trained in art formally? I didn't catch it in the
Yeah, but I took industrial design. I didn't take fine art. I kind of taught myself painting. But the perspective and all came in as part of industrial design. And one thing if it's a secret, I found that perspective, like you mentioned, is so much easier when you do it small. So just about everything I do, I draw small and then enlarge. And the perspective is almost always dead on when you do it that way.
Did I hear Cass Stack mentioned?
Yes.
When you graduated from there, I taught there for 22 years.
I think it was 1865. I think it was 1965. No, I got married in 1963.
And your website, how many pieces of your art, drawings, and prints? You have a couple dozen still available, right?
Yeah, there's a couple dozen on there, but everything's changing so much in printing. A lot of them are actually out of print and probably will not be printed again.
And you will be, and the Dawson Great Lakes Museum has a benefit each year. It used to be at the War Memorial. It was, previous to that, it was down at the Dawson, but it's now at the VFW Hall at Martin or 11 and a half in Jefferson. You're going to be at that show again too, right? And that's coming up, it used to be the weekend before Thanksgiving, but now it's in October.
This is the Marine Market?
Yeah, the Marine Market.
Yeah, that's October 8th.
Thank you. So that's coming up in less than a month.
It kept interfering with deer season.
But you'll have a table and you'll have, you have most of your prints that you still have available at that show, right? For sale. And of course tonight he's got books and he's got the Griffon print with him. Do you still sell that print, the Griffon?
Okay. That's available on my website or through me if you're in the thumb area and want to stop by and see my studio, by all means, give me a call and talk to me.
Your voice is very nice. It's very short.
Thanks. Yes?
One more question. You live in Harbor Beach now, so that's where your studio is, Harbor Beach. Are you also involved with the Freddie Murphy complex there, the historical museum complex?
Not really. The only involvement I have is with the Harbor Beach Lighthouse Preservation Society. And I did a meeting for them at the lighthouse about 4 years ago, and I donated it to them. And they auctioned it off, and they got $10,000 for it.
10,000, wow. Is that what your oil paintings go for now? No.
You know anything about the basic performance capabilities of the boat? It looks heavily over canvas. Some of the tricks you're talking about indicate it's actually quite fast.
It was. The wind was from the stern. They had no keel. They really couldn't sail any degrees into the wind. But if the wind were in a favorable position, like I said, from the stern, they could do like 6 miles an hour. And when they were out in deep lake, they sailed night and day. It was only along the shoreline that they sailed during the day. And they sounded the sounding lead all the time they were sailing. So they did make good time under favorable conditions. And we know the 2 days that it took to sail from St. David's to Washington Island, that's under 200 miles. So that would be 2 days, 24 hours of constant sailing. So that's a pretty good 200 miles on a ship like this. So they were good sailors.
That's what they were unstable in terms of the anglers.
Well, as it turned out, it was.
Bob's got a signed book, so let's give Mike Dixon the last question here.
The last question is, I want to take the opportunity 40 years hence to thank you again for letting me use one of your drawings, my book.
Oh, thank you.
You want the one on the flats, on the St. Clair
Grosse
flats?
Pointe.
Oh, okay. Yeah, well, that was better. Okay, well.
Good, all right, thank you so much. Bob will be in the back.